Kevin Costner was based on Brin's novel The Postman, and other works have been optioned by Paramount and Warner Brothers. David's science fiction uplift saga explores genetic engineering of higher animals, like dolphins, in order to speak. And his new novel from Tor Books is Existence, which I get the feeling we're going to learn just a little bit more about. As a scientist and futurist, David is seen frequently on television shows, such as The Architects Universe and Life After People, with many appearances on PBS, BBC, and NPR. As an inventor of many patents, he has frequently spoken about future trends and is keynoted for IBM, Google, Procter & Gamble, SAP, Microsoft, Qualcomm, the Modeling Group, and Casey Research, Homeland Security, and the University of California, San Diego. I'll get to that, add starting block to that impressive list after today, and as well as STGlobal. Dr. Brin serves on advisory panels ranging from astronomy, NASA Innovative Concepts, nanotech, and SETI, to national defense and technological ethics. His nonfiction book, The Transparent Society, explores the dangers of secrecy and loss of privacy in our modern world, and has garnered the prestigious Freedom of Speech Prize from the American Library Association. Please join me in welcoming, on behalf of STGlobal, Dr. David Brin.
Wow, I'd like to meet that guy. Thank you for spending the time. I know that you're eager to get out and get to the beach. Actually, it's not so much of a joke in this weather. It's beautiful. It's nicer than San Diego. I'd like to thank the organizing committee, Jeremy and the others, and Dr. Mike Nelson for organizing this. I'm in town for a couple of other reasons, but these are my favorite people. The bright, young, and young at heart, and young at mind types. We're actually very much like dogs in one respect, and that is, dogs, it turns out, are the neotenous, canines are the neotenizable species. We made wolves into dogs by breeding them to never grow up. You know, think of Mary Martin. No, that's dating me. Kathy Rigby. I won't grow up. Dogs remain puppies. They remain floppy-eared. Adolescent to young wolves bark and wag their tails. They stop when they grow up. We have not neotenized ourselves. We're the creatures who decided never to grow up, in a sense. As a matter of fact, there's a wonderful novel by Aldous Huxley. You all know Brave New World, but you should, if you have reading patience, because it's a more languid pace in those days, you should get your hands on a book called After Many a Summer Dies the Swan. And you find that it's a science fiction novel all along on the last page, in which Huxley explored in the 1930s something that is just now popping into our attention and we think we invented, and that's the biome, the notion that in our gut is the secret of longer life. In all the parts of us that are not us. By sheer number, half the cells in our body don't contain our DNA, but are bacteria that are either symbiotic or parasitical, commensal. And in this book, they discover a biota that if you eat it and it enters your intestines, you can effectively live forever. All right, it's going to be harder than that. And during questions I can explain why you're not going to see any low-hanging fruit in human immortality anytime soon, despite what they're promising. And I wish I were wrong. But we can answer that during questions. But the crux of it, and I'm going to spoil the book a little bit for you, is that if you do live 200 years, and they find that this discoverer of this biota, this 200 years ago, is still alive. And he's kept in the basement by his great-great-grandnieces along with his mistress. And why are they keeping them? And they look inside and they're, they finally grew up and they developed their hair and they developed it into apes. This is one of the things that science fiction does. It explores, in exaggeration, possibilities, places in possibility space. Now, mind you, let's recall Sturgeon's law, 90% of anything is crap. And given the wave of simplistic, repetitive dystopias and fantasies that have pretty much taken over my field, including the Hugo nominations this year, I'd have to say 99.9%, but you can still find in science fiction thought experiments. Gedanken experiments, as Einstein, this should be part of your vocabulary. The Gedanken experiment is what Einstein did that was 50% of relativity. The thought experiment, imagining himself on a trolley riding at 99% of the speed of light away from the Brin clock tower. And what would the rays, where would the rays catch up with different things? And that bicyclist over there and all of that. And what would they see as the rays hit the different part of the streetcar? And he got the notion of the foreshortening and all of that just from the fact that the speed of light is constant in all reference frames. And the rest, the last 50% was just math, and he left that to his wife. Well, actually, sort of. The point is that the thought experiment is what we do with these little nubs above the eyes. The most recent thing we ever evolved. We share the medulla and the cerebellum with fish. We share the primate, the basic mammalian cortex with other mammals, the primate cortex with other primates. But these prefrontal lobes truly took off in us. And you can relate them to a moment in the Bible. And you really should read that book and become familiar with it, because you're the smart ones. You should be multicultural and multilingual. You should be able to talk to people in scriptural terms. And one element is that Moses was said to have lamps on his brow. Well, they couldn't figure out what that meant, so all through the Middle Ages, they assumed it had been mistranslated, and that he had horns on his brow. And so all depictions of Moses throughout the Middle Ages showed him with horns. Even respectful renditions, like the sculpture of Moses by Michelangelo. If you're ever in Rome, you have to see it. It's the best thing Michelangelo ever did. You swear he's about to stand up. But lamps on his brow, what does that mean? What does it mean? I interpret it to mean that he had better foresight. He was able to speculate about the possible consequences of his actions and of the actions of others. Because these are what we use to project and extrapolate ourselves into future times, for example, with a thought experiment. What will people think if I raise this idea at the meeting? What will people think if I wear this today? What will happen if I try to run this yellow light? This is something that we're halfway good at. And ladies, you have no idea how many of these thought experiments pass through the male brain and are answered with, no, no. That's how we go through life. No. The point is that, and I'm sure you do too, the point is that these lamps on the brow are what enable us not only to think about possible futures, but also extrapolate ourselves being in the shoes of other people. What might it be like to be that person over there? What might she be thinking? What might he be planning to do next? And we're never very good at these extrapolations. We're never accurate. We often fool ourselves into thinking we're accurate and attribute to other people meanings, motives that they didn't really have or they weren't aware of. We know all of this because people who've had prefrontal lobotomies lose interest in doing thought experiments about the future. They remain intelligent. They just don't speculate about the future anymore. Which is why I'd much rather have a free bottle in front of me than a prefrontal lobotomy. Well, I'm sure you heard from Rod Atkinson earlier fascinating things about waves of innovation taking place in our civilization. And I wish I could have been here for his talk. The notion of extrapolating a little bit farther and using science fiction to explore possibilities, well, you know, this is harnessing the human imagination. And this is one of the reasons why we recently established at UCSD the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination. Look it up online, and we're hoping that it will become a force for exploring what it is that imagination does. A good place for it because UCSD has a surrounding community of neuroscience and cognitive science that's going to be brought into play. But also, it's a hotbed for science fiction and some of the other arts. After all, it's the lower left corner, it's where everything loose rolls. The point is that I have been engaged in this, partly because civilization is willing to pay me to do it. I was trained as an engineer, trained as a scientist, and I did some good science. But it turns out that it's just nice to be paid for something that's easier. And people are willing to pay me much more to speculate and be interesting than they ever paid me to be right. Now, I knew I would write when I was a child. I came from a family of writers. I was arrogant enough to assume someday I would publish novels. I assumed it would be an ancillary to my being a scientist, and people asked, why would you choose science if you could do both? Well, it's a very interesting question. And I thought about it over the years while I was struggling my way through Caltech. It would have been easier if I'd been a creative writing major. Why did I choose that path? Well, one reason is because every human civilization has had storytellers. Every civilization has had artists in the arts. You hear all this propaganda saying the arts are special, the arts are wonderful, we wouldn't be human without the arts, and the arts are rare. It's all right. That's completely true, except the last one. Art fizzes out of the human pores. It leverages against the greatest human talent, which is delusion. And there has never been a civilization without it. And those civilizations that tried to repress the arts, well, then here's an experiment. I'd like you to go out right now, out of the street, and kill all the artists. Within 6 months, there will be more art. Kill them again. Within 6 months, there will be more art. Kill them again, and it will appear that the average quality goes down. In part because you've killed some real geniuses, but mostly because the artists have started taking the hint and gone underground. They've done it before. I've known many fabulous artists who thrived in the underground artistic communities of the Eastern Bloc and the Iron Curtain. And they say they miss the drama, though they would die to prevent it from ever coming back. Why is it, I thought, that all the great scientists I've ever known had artistic hobbies, some of which they were professionally good at? Is it because scientists are better and they're able to be polymaths? No, I suddenly realized one day, it's because polymaths who want to do both science and art have to choose science as their day job. It's obvious. You have to choose science as your day job because that's what requires 8 hours of focused attention just to get through grad school. I'm sorry, 14. And your art, you can turn up the heat, you can turn down the heat, you can be as passionate about your art as you are about your science, but you can turn it on and off at will. That's why it's not that scientists are smart enough to be polymaths and regular artists aren't. It's that polymaths choose to call themselves scientists. How many of you have an artistic hobby? Come on. There you go. And some of you just haven't found yours yet. Now, this is going way off from where I was going to talk, but it's basically about my sensitivity about being bald, because it's not from losing my hair, it's from switching hats. Yeah. forth between the arts and the sciences and all that. I'm going to offer you a little bit of context in which to put what I was talking about the prefrontal lobes and our knack for anticipation. And that context comes in several pieces. First off, what is it that the prefrontal lobes do? They are partly about anticipation. And every time I come to DC, I consult with various agencies whose job it is to protect us. And the professional protector caste takes their duty to anticipate problems very, very seriously. And they're always depressed when I leave because I say, you will fail. Hopefully, all the work you're doing will make you fail less often. But if 9/11, Katrina, Fukushima, Iraq, if all of these things haven't taught you that we make models about the future and they are only slightly helpful, and they inevitably get around to failing, what do we do when anticipation fails? We do the other thing, and that's resilience, robustness. You have a civilization that can roll with the punches. This is why it upset me so much. I mean, Elaine Scarry of the Boston Globe and Rebecca Solnit, who wrote a wonderful book called A Paradise Made in Hell. You really should see it. And I were just about the only people pointing out that we won the war on terror the day it began. On 9/11, we were tested. Every generation of Americans is tested by whatever foe we have at any given time, because there is a rationalization that goes through the minds of zero-sum game people when they see someone who is happy and successful. And that is, you traded away something in order to get your success and your pleasures and your material wealth and your happiness. How many of you really have parsed out the distinction between a zero-sum game and a positive-sum game? You know these, right? Robert Wright's book, Non-Zero, is extremely important. You have to understand the difference between the positive, zero, and negative-sum games. Positive-sum game is one in which everybody wins. Somebody wins a little more than everybody else and gets bragging rights. A zero-sum game is your typical board game. Chess, whatever. I pick up a point by you losing a point. A negative-sum game is Samson pulling down the temple on himself in order to get his enemies. Here's a test. Ask someone you know, what would you wish for if knowing your enemy would get twice as much? Well, that was a positive-sum gamer out there. Ask for lots of money. You don't hate anybody enough to work hard at this problem. Fine. May that be your situation your whole life. You just don't hate anybody enough to worry about that. I thought of a good one. May you be married. Well, this works with guys. May you be married to all the woman you can handle. I'm sure there's a correlate version that you ladies could come up with. I once had somebody tell me that he would wish to be blind in one eye. There's your negative-sum game. The point is that if you have a zero-sum game way of looking at the world, you don't understand why Americans are happy and wealthy and all of our success. You assume we traded something. And this was the propaganda spread by all of our enemies. If you go back, you find it straight on down the line. It's what the Nazis said, it's what it was standard Soviet propaganda, and it's certainly what Osama bin Laden was saying. And inevitably, it means that we're cowards. were fat and lazy cowards. And we have to expensively disprove it. And on 9/11, 70 volunteers aboard flight UA-93 proved it wrong. They stood up, charged the cockpit of that plane, and brought it down rather than let it be used as a weapon against those nations' capital. And we did not have to go crazy after that. But that's a little editorializing here. The point is that resilience was king that day. There were people in New York and in this town who did what was necessary armed with this. They did what was necessary armed with this. And one of the things I badger them with in this town every time I come here is some of the flaws in resiliency in our own republic right now. For instance, why do these not have a backup peer-to-peer text passing capability? The capability of passing text messages to each other using the 50-year-old mathematics of packet switching, so that they would eventually find their way out of whatever area has lost all of its cell system. There were people who died. There was a woman who died in Fukushima. They found her cell phone. She was under rubble. People were passing by outside the building, right and left. Her cell phone had something like 60 or 70 outgoing texts. But there was no cell system. The people walking by could have picked up her message. With a few dozen repeaters across the Great Plains and the Rockies, we could, if we had that in our phones, have a functioning cross-continental telegraphy system if every cell phone tower in the country was down. If we just had this backup capability. And a guy from Verizon told me we wouldn't know how to charge for that. And I said, you should be fired. If you can't program your phones to tattletale that a message of yours was passed on, and give everyone who passes it along a penny for passing it along, you extend your text coverage into dark zones. The enemy of our resilience is the same thing as the enemies of imagination. Anywhere in the world where you see science fiction thriving, you know that it's going to be a positive-sum game, because the possibilities are just too stark to have things be different than they are. I spoke of anticipation and resilience. I'm going to briefly mention another thing that should be on your horizon. How many of you have heard of the singularity? All right, roll your eyes now. Look, even if it's coming true, these guys are so tedious. I'm invited to their conferences all the time, and I decided for one of them, I decided I would just, blow their minds. So I gave a half-hour speech about Scripture. I talked to them about Genesis. I talked to them about the Garden of Eden. I talked to them about especially the metaphor of the Tower of Babel. And I showed them that if they were not to show contempt to their neighbors for whom these are cultural anchors, but instead use their brains to actually spend a few minutes to understand it, every time I have spoken with a religious fundamentalist about these issues and challenged them to realize that according to the Bible, we were meant to be co-creators, and that an open-ended mission of picking up God's tools was what Einstein was talking about. He said the most amazing thing to him was that the lights were obviously left on in the workroom and the door left ajar. And if you look at the, actually, you can find this online. I don't have time for it, but you can find this online. My riff about the Tower of Babel, how it basically proves this. And here's the interesting thing. I found that when I have done these little spiels with real fundamentalists, I found that they were always more friendly toward me rather than less, even though I challenged them. Why? Because I took the effort. I had the courtesy of not sneering at their perspective, but instead using their touchstones to talk to me. I'm supposed to be the smart one, right? You're supposed to be the one who can talk to your opponents. If you find yourself in a political stalemate, peel away the moderates from the other side and weaken that side by finding some common ground with the moderates. That's what you're supposed to be capable of doing. All right, the singularity. We have had transcendentalists in every culture who were unhappy with the hand that we're dealt and would promise us a better realm. The only difference is now those who can't do science are still offering us the old techniques for getting to that better realm. But now there's some brainiacs among them who are offering hope that we can get to that better realm technologically. And there are some very interesting aspects to this that if you want, we can talk about that during the questions, because it's going to be harder than we think. More power to them. I want to discuss something else that is a context. Now, you may be wondering where I'm going with all of this. I'm offering you some big picture contexts. Oh, by the way, some of you may not have heard of the singularity. That's us becoming gods within 10 years. That's all. Well, that's what Ray Kurzweil thinks. But he's older than me. There's a funny age versus timing thing that goes on in the singularity community. If you're 60, it's going to happen in 20 years. If you're 50, it's going to happen in 30 years. If you're 40, it's hard. It's going to take 40 years. Here's another piece of context for you, and this is more serious. Every human civilization but ours followed a very, very simple pattern if it had agriculture and metallurgy. Very quickly, large males picked up metal implements and took other men's women and wheat. It was standard. It crossed all continents, and we're all descended from the harems who pulled this off. And this explains male fantasies, because we all imagine that we could do it too. These cultures were shaped like a pyramid, with a few at the top lording it over those below. Adjusting the rules of that civilization so that wealth is inherited, status is inherited. Now, we have a lot of politically correct rules in our civilization, but if you are truly scientific types, you can usually distill it down so that you can tell the difference between important political correctness and unimportant political correctness. And what it boils down to is this: avoiding waste. Waste of human potential. And we have learned the hard way that you waste a lot of human potential if you prejudge what an individual person is going to be capable of based upon any clade that they have no choice of being a member of, including race, gender, any of those things. That does not mean that that clade may not have different averages from other clades. That does not mean that the average woman would prefer not to be a soldier. What it means is this is all irrelevant. Generalities may be valid for discussion, but they have nothing whatsoever to do with any individual person's right to say, try me, I'm different. I want to take this on. Now, if you reduce it to that, that's not only justice, it's pragmatic not to waste talent. And most of the truly just things that we have on our agenda correlate with things that are actually very pragmatic. Freedom of speech, for example. I mentioned the greatest human talent, self-delusion. Well, actually, delusion in general. I make my income by you folks buying prepackaged delusions that I've created. Really, truly, it's amazing. We've managed to convince our civilization to consider it a crime that 4 or 5% of the population can't rapidly decrypt black squiggles across sheets of vegetable matter, or whatever it is you've got. And decrypt them, these coded incantations, with such skill that you stop noticing that there are black squiggles on the page. But instead, I'll instantly transform them into star-spanning explosions, deep human insights, credible conversations, Gedanken experiments. You do this, and I create incantations for you. Squiggle, 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 squiggle. And that is the only known form of replicable, scientifically replicable, industrial-grade magic. Because it's the creating of subjective realities in other people's heads and having them suspend disbelief and believe that it's true for a while. Oh, believe me, in my fiction, you will. The point is that we have this masterful ability for delusion. And here's the human tragedy. When you combine that with pyramidal social structure, you get incredibly, impossibly bad statecraft. And I have just explained human history. Most of human history is explicable by the fact you have a narrow, ruling clay capable of deluding itself. Napoleon, your emperor, I hear they have snow in Russia. If you evade the criticism that can help you to improve what you're doing, what does that say about you? Cito Kate, criticism is the only known antidote to error. And yet it's the one thing we absolutely despise. We avoid it however we can. It's instinctive. And if you have taught yourself to grit your teeth and seek criticism, guess what? It's the one most valuable thing you can get, and you can get it for free. Your enemies will give it to you for free. And they will be boggled and confused by your gratitude. If you can make it seem as if you're taking notes, oh. Now, these first 4 things you said are complete bullshit because you're a psycho. But these things, you've just helped me to make my product better. Talk about a win-win. So why do we do it so seldom? I think that this has brought us to my 4th piece of context, but I'm going to get to that in a second. Well, I'll just tell you what it is. I think that that's one of the reasons why we seem to be alone in the universe. Because this is an extremely difficult thing to overcome. And it's what our enlightenment is all about. Number 4 is the Fermi paradox. And I just alluded to that. How many of you have heard of the Fermi paradox? It's called the Great Silence. I've got a bunch of papers about that as well. And that is the question of why we seem to be alone in the universe. I've been involved in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence since about 1980. We're actually having some real fights in the field right now. And the notion of that the radio telescopes, they thought they were going to pick up traffic in no time. They thought they were going to pick up garish tutorial beacons, saying, all you bright young races, here's what you need to know. Here's the salvation to all your problems. And all we've been getting is static and silence out there. Worse, the Earth has had a perfect biosphere. It's had an oxygen atmosphere for more than 1 billion years and nothing to defend it. from colonization? Why did Independence Day happen to show up when we could defend ourselves? Why not 100 years ago, or 10,000, or 1 million years ago? The point is that if they had visited the Earth and dropped a Coke bottle or peed in the ocean, at any point, it would have changed life on Earth, and we would see it in our rocks. This is a pretty big wondering. And I don't have time to go into it except to say that there's a filter somewhere in the drink equation. Either planets are more rare than we think, but just in the last 15 years, we found out our number of extrasolar planets we know about leaped from 0 to 1,000 and rapidly rising. Or good planets are rare, or life is more difficult to erupt than all the evidence seems to indicate, or intelligence, it's starting to see there's some real meat there, or civilization, technology, or the filter might be in our future. They mostly might be themselves out. They mostly do terrible ecological mismanagement, as I described in my novel Earth. There are any number of possibilities here, and what the SETI debate really boils down to is a discussion of all the things that brought us about. All the different things that brought us about. From astrophysics to planetology to ecology to biology and so on. It all comes into play. In fact, I think it would be a really good centerpiece for a curriculum. And some university that wanted to experiment with that. So what do we do about all this? What do all these things imply? The singularity implies that we're going to have to be very, very wise very, very soon. Stuff may accelerate. And the singularity does not necessarily have to be a happy one. All it means is that artificial intelligence is going to get very, very smart. It doesn't necessarily mean we get to go along for a ride. So we're going to have to become smart enough to make very, very good decisions. We're going to have to learn how to, just want to keep track of time here. We're going to have to learn how to decide whether or not we are going to either become gods or the grandparents of gods. Because in effect, that's what's the case. There's nothing new about that. How many of you have ever flown through the sky? How many of you have ever walked into a room and made light happen with your fingertips? I want you for the next week, every time you turn on a light switch in the room, to do it dramatically. You'll notice that it adds a zest to life. Like when you're taking off, or your plane is taking off, go, whee! How do we deal with this singularity thing? How do we deal with the fact that most human civilizations were like this? And there's a constant pull back there because it is the natural attractor state of human civilizations. How do we deal with the possibility that the filters lie in front of us, as I explained in my new novel, and that we have to bear in mind that at any point in time we may bump into the thing that has made the galaxy relatively empty. We do it in one of two ways. Jared Diamond, you've heard of him. He wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel. He recently wrote Collapse. A fantastic book, very important book, about showing the ways in which civilizations can collapse. But then he makes this dour, dyspeptic leap to his recommendation, and always separate the criticism from the advice. You do not have to accept advice from your enemies, but listen to their criticisms. Diamond is very strong in his criticisms, but then his advice falls into the general category, and I portray this extensively in existence. Renunciationism. And you run into this throughout our civilization, and that is the notion that Enlightenment technological civilization is a mistake. or at least has gone too far. You hear the hoary old phrases, if only our wisdom had kept up with our technology. It is repeated so often that even technological people nod sagely to this. Utter and complete bullshit. It's ridiculous. Look around this room and see. Turn around. Look. Look at the people here. I don't see a front row filled with professors and working our way back to the postdocs, to the graduate students, to all that sort of stuff. You guys remember that, don't you? I know 60, 70-year-old scientists who are more agile in their minds today than they were when they were 30, because we've been adapting to a more agile world. And oh yes, okay, the other meaning that you thought I meant, tolerance, diversity, the different types of people we see in this audience. In the year 2001, people were moaning, oh, it's too bad we don't have these rotating wheel space stations spinning to Strauss waltzes. Well, sorry, space is hard. Then why did we land on the moon in 1969? Because we were crazy. More computing power than all of NASA? Go down the block. Walk into the most sacred building on the planet. Oh, I'm sorry. All right, Independence Hall is slightly more sacred. But you know which building. You know. Walk in and look around and say, we did that, we did that, we did that, we did that, we did that. And then turn left and go to the end of the hall and stand in front of the Lunar Excursion Module. And say, what if we're lucky, our great distant descendants, even though they're going to be, will stand there and they will look at it and say what you will say, and that is, human beings had the balls to go in that? And it worked every time. We're told that we can save ourselves through nostalgia and renunciation. And that will mean 3 billion fewer people, and they will not go quietly. The way is forward. The way is keeping faith with the one thing that has enabled us to improve human life more than any other generation has ever improved human life. Steven Pinker, Harvard professor, has a book out to finally distill things a lot of us have been saying for 20 years. It's called The Better Angels of Our Nature. It is hated across the spectrum from left to right. Because it says we're better. Violence per capita across the globe has plummeted every decade since 1945. Plummeted. And all we can see is the wars and the violence and the murders. Yeah, duh, that's how you keep it plummeting. Is by fixating on what needs to be fixed. I'm not saying this in order for you to become complacent. I'm not afraid that you'll become complacent. What I'm afraid is that our fellow citizens will lose their nerve. What I'm afraid is the relentless propaganda from the right that we don't have to improve, and the left that we've never improved, will take hold. And the modernist agenda of the Enlightenment will be forgotten. And that is, we can improve, we have improved, we will improve, we have to, or we won't be the first to get out there to the stars and help everybody else. Because it could be that a lot more than us is riding on this. Those Strauss waltzes and all that, look at the movie 2001. Actually watch it again. Take a look at the society that's portrayed. Of stodgy, prissy, nasty, secretive white males who think that their countrymen will go crazy if told that we dug up a magnetic rock on the moon. Today, if we found this thing and when the signal went to Jupiter and we made an expedition to Jupiter, there would have been at least one woman astronaut aboard that spaceship who would talk to poor Hal instead of driving him into the systematic range with their power grid. No. It's not a matter of has our wisdom kept up with our technology. It's a matter of we don't have enough of either. The Enlightenment has achieved what it's achieved by developing techniques to get past human delusion. And we do this by dividing power, as in the Constitution, as in breaking up monopolies and antitrust, which hasn't been done in a long time. And this is what Adam Smith recommended. Get your right-wing friends to actually read him instead of misquoting him. Get your left-wing friends to read him and realize how much on their side he is. We have these accountability arenas. We have democracy. We have science. We have justice courts, and we have markets. And they all have in common one trait. They deliver positive-sum gains through competition. Not the unbridled, horrific competition that made us. Because we don't want blood on the floor. We would rather have competition that gets the positive-sum benefits of competitiveness without the blood. Duh. Always in the past, the winners would take over, form a pyramid, and kill all potential competitors. You call that competition? But by keeping the playing field level, markets create new products, goods, and services. Democracy creates new policies. Science, by far the most competitive field the human beings have ever created. And this is what we should answer the Fox News propaganda against science with. They try to portray us as being, and the left does it too. Remember, there's a distinction between liberals and leftists. They're merely temporary allies. To portray scientists as sniveling little herd lemmings. You guys know what it is. How many of you are postdocs who just got, or associate professors who just got tenure? How many of you hope to be within 4 years, 5 years, 6 years? All right, you know the people I'm talking about. I'm sure they're more than that. I've got them intimidated. These are, if you are a newly tenured associate professor who's got a good grant, there is no more ferocious person on the planet. These are the young guns walking down Main Street looking for some old fart to shoot down. And you old farts, you know they're coming for you. And the great thing about science is that most of you are saying, bring it. Bring it. These accountability arenas that harness competition and make it look like cooperation, and make it be a correlate with cooperation, and positive sum to help create a better world. This is how we stave off the pyramid. This is how we maintain the world's only diamond-shaped social structure, in which the well-off and empowered middle class outnumbers both the rich and the poor. The only time that's ever happened. And when that happens, poverty, instead of becoming a vast sea that you shrug as Jesus did, It will always be with us. What can you do? Instead, it becomes a bitter lake. Surrounded by affluence, all of a sudden it's somebody's fault. And we can have the ambition to end it. This is what many other cultures would consider madness. Our individualism, our constant self-criticism, our science fiction. But if it is madness, it's not, that's a good thing, because it means that it probably hasn't been tried on many other planets. The biological drive that maintains a pyramidal social structure, that maintain these structures in almost all human civilizations, this may be the great filter out there. And if it is, then our enlightenment is the one chance, perhaps, of getting past it. Of running a civilization so broad, so diverse, that when AI shows up and says, okay, I'm a heap big AI, huh? And we say, huh, interesting. Okay, get on the Tonight Show and we'll interview you, and maybe you'll have more than 15 minutes before the next AI comes around, based on dolphins. If we have enough diversity, then any one problem, then any one failure mode may not be a failure mode for all of us. Well, perhaps I've been all over the place more than you expected. My purpose here, since I'm doing it for free, was to talk about things that might be interesting. And I hope that I've touched on a few topics and raged you a couple of times, and made you consider some things to follow up on. If nothing else, follow up on the positive sum game. Look upon this civilization as being an experiment in success, an experiment in survival, an experiment that deserves our loyalty, and something that we can perfect, perhaps within our own lifetimes, but it is better to sow than to reap. So if you can just see your grandchildren being marginally better than us, then maybe that'll be good enough. Thanks a lot. And now, I guess, how do we do this?
Questions? These microphones as before?
And yeah, well, you take